The sound was wrong. That was the first thing I noticed. At 6:42 in the morning, standing on my back deck with the first cup of coffee of the day, the sounds are predictable. There is the gentle lapping of the water from Cinder Lake against the pilings of my dock. There is the cry of a loon, usually a pair of them, echoing across the still surface of the water as the mist begins to burn off. There is the distant hum of the first few cars on the county highway, more a feeling in the soles of your feet than an actual noise. But this sound was different. It was a sharp, metallic snap. A grating, rhythmic squeak. A low, guttural murmur of voices where there should have been none. I lowered my coffee mug, the steam curling up into the cool morning air, and leaned against the railing. My property slopes gently down to the lake, about 100 yards of manicured lawn, giving way to a patch of wild reeds, and then the sturdy wooden structure of my dock. It's a substantial thing, an L-shaped pier with slips for 3 boats, and a wider platform at the end. At the shoreward end, where the walkway meets the land, there is a gate, a simple functional gate made of galvanized steel with a heavy-duty padlock. It was this gate that was the source of the unnatural sound. 3 figures were clustered around it. 2 were large men in work coats, one of whom was holding a pair of bolt cutters the size of a small child. The third figure, standing with her hands on her hips in a posture of profound and unearned authority, was Brenda Albright. She was the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, the sprawling development of identical beige houses that bordered my property to the east. She was wearing a pink tracksuit and a visor, a bizarre uniform for what was clearly an act of criminal trespass. I didn't move. I didn't shout. I simply raised my phone, which I always have with me, and began recording. The lens was good enough to capture the scene clearly, even from that distance. I watched as the man with the bolt cutters positioned them on the shackle of my padlock. Brenda said something, gesturing impatiently. The man gave a grunt of effort, and there was another sharp snap, louder this time, that echoed over the water. The padlock fell to the ground. The second man pulled the gate open, its hinges groaning in protest. They had trespassed before, of course. Little forays, a couple of teenagers fishing off the end of the pier, a family having a picnic on the platform. I had always handled it quietly, with a polite request for them to leave, which they usually did with embarrassed apologies. But this was different. This was a declaration. This was a physical, premeditated act of aggression. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was still hot. I let the warmth spread through my chest. A small anchor of normalcy in a profoundly abnormal moment. Then I walked back into my kitchen, placed the mug carefully on the granite countertop, and walked down the gentle slope of my lawn toward them. My phone was still in my hand, still recording. Brenda saw me coming. A triumphant, smug smile spread across her face. She thought this was the climax of her campaign, the moment of her victory. She thought the sight of me, a quiet man in his late 60s, would be the final, satisfying note in her little power play. "Good morning, Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with condescending cheerfulness. "We're just restoring community access. You've had your little fun, but the residents are tired of being locked out of their own marina." I stopped about 10 feet from them, keeping a polite distance. I didn't look at the 2 men, who were now looking distinctly uncomfortable, shuffling their feet and avoiding my gaze. I looked directly at Brenda. I said nothing. My silence seemed to unnerve her more than any angry outburst would have. "This dock," she said, waving a hand at the entire structure, "is a community asset. It has been used by the residents of Whispering Pines for 20 years. Your little fence is an illegal obstruction." She pointed a finger at me. "I am Brenda Albright, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, and I am officially informing you that you are to cease and desist from impeding access. We will be sending you the bill for the locksmith, and you will be fined $1,000 a day for every day the gate was illegally locked. If you interfere with us today, I will have you arrested for harassment." I let her finish. I let the threats hang in the air. I let my phone capture every word, every nuance of her self-assured, belligerent tone. Her entire case rested on a foundation of feelings, of assumptions, of what she felt ought to be true. She spoke of community assets and historic use, as if they were legal principles that superseded something as mundane as a property deed. When she was finally done, her chest puffed out with the righteousness of her cause. I lowered my phone slightly. I looked at the broken padlock on the ground, then at the open gate, then at the vast, placid lake behind her, and I thought, with a clarity that was almost startling, that she had no idea. She had no idea who I was. She had no idea what my career had been. She had no idea that for the past 3 years, I had been meticulously documenting her every transgression, every baseless fine, every overreach of her petty authority. She had no idea that her act of cutting a $50 padlock was about to cost her, and her precious HOA, a sum of money that would make her head spin. She had no idea she had just declared war on a man who had spent 40 years of his professional life perfecting the art of winning without ever raising his voice. She had absolutely no idea what she had just done, but before I tell you what I did next, I should probably explain how we got here. It's a story not just about a dock, but about the nature of rules, the illusion of ownership, and the profound, almost comical, ignorance of people who believe their will was law. My name is Arthur Pendleton. For 41 years I was a licensed civil engineer and a certified land surveyor. My specialty, the niche that made my firm indispensable to municipalities and large developers, was riparian law and land use rights. In plain English, I was the man people called when they needed to know exactly who owned what, especially when water was involved. I drew the lines. I read the centuries-old deeds, written in elegant, looping cursive. I understood the complex interplay of state statutes, county ordinances, and recorded easements that form the invisible architecture of property ownership. My job was to replace ambiguity with certainty, to take a messy, emotional dispute and reduce it to a set of coordinates, a legal description, a recorded plat. I was, for all intents and purposes, a professional resolver of conflicts. But I did it with transit levels and property databases, not with arguments. I am a widower. My wife Eleanor passed away 6 years ago. We were married for 45 years. Her illness was long and difficult, and during that time, our large family home in the city became a place of hushed whispers and medical equipment. After she was gone, the silence in that house was deafening. Every room held a ghost. I sold it within 6 months, and started looking for a place where the silence would be peaceful, not sorrowful. I found it here on the western shore of Cinder Lake. It was a modest, single-story house on a 1.5-acre lot. The key feature, the thing that made me sign the papers almost immediately, was that it was one of only 3 properties on the lake, not part of the Whispering Pines, HOA. It was an older parcel, grandfathered in, an island of independence surrounded by a sea of beige conformity. Eleanor would have loved it. She valued privacy above all else. The house was our sanctuary, and now it was mine. The dock was part of the property. It was listed explicitly in the deed, its boundaries described down to the 100th of a foot, tied to survey monuments I could still locate if I needed to. The previous owner was a man named Mr. Henderson Sr., a retired school teacher who had lived here for 50 years. When the Whispering Pines development was built 2 decades ago, the developer, a man named Clark, had approached him. Clark's plans for a community marina were ambitious, but he'd run into a permitting issue. To get the density of boat slips he wanted, he needed a long, stable, primary pier extending into deeper water. Building one from scratch on the HOA's designated common land would have required extensive, expensive dredging and environmental reviews. Mr. Henderson's dock, however, was perfectly positioned, so Clark made a gentleman's agreement with him in exchange for letting the new residents use the main pier to access their smaller, floating slips that Clark would install nearby. Clark would pay for the dock's upkeep. There was no paperwork, no easement was ever recorded. It was a handshake deal, a neighborly accommodation from a kind old man who didn't use his boat much anymore. It was a license, not a right, a temporary, revocable permission. I learned all of this during my due diligence before I bought the house. It was a loose end, but a manageable one. When I moved in, I found the Whispering Pines residents treated the dock as their own. They walked down the pier, they tied their boats to it, they used the platform for sunbathing. For the first year I let it be. I was grieving. I had no energy for conflict. I would occasionally see Brenda Albright, even then the self-important queen of the HOA, leading groups on community tours and pointing out the wonderful amenities, including my dock. My first direct interaction with her came about a year after I moved in. I had decided to install the gate, not out of malice, but for liability. My insurance agent had pointed out that if one of the HOA residents slipped and fell on my dock, I would be the one getting sued. The gate was a simple, prudent measure. I put a sign on it: private property, no trespassing. The very next day, I received a letter in a crisp, Whispering Pines envelope. It was a formal notice of violation. I was being fined $100 for an unapproved structural modification visible from community property. It was signed in an absurdly large and florid script by Brenda Albright, president. This was the moment. This was the first move in the game. I could have gone over there, deed in hand, and had an argument. I could have explained that my property was not subject to her ridiculous rules. But my entire professional life had taught me that arguments are useless. Documentation is everything. So I wrote a check for $100 and mailed it to the HOA. I didn't write "under protest" in the memo line. I just paid it, and I kept the receipt. I kept a copy of the violation notice. I photographed the canceled check when it came back in my bank statement. I opened a new folder in my filing cabinet, a simple manila folder. On the tab, I wrote HOA. This became my method. Over the next 3 years, Brenda's campaign against me escalated, and my folder grew thicker. She fined me for the color of my mailbox, which she claimed clashed with the community aesthetic. I paid it. I kept the receipt. She sent a notice complaining that the model of my riding lawnmower was too loud and violated a noise ordinance that didn't even apply to my property. The fine was $250. I paid it. I kept the receipt. I was building a paper trail of her harassment, of her deliberate and knowing overreach of authority onto a property she did not control. Each check I wrote was another brick in the wall of evidence I was constructing. Each canceled check was her signature on a confession. She thought she was bleeding me with 1,000 cuts. In reality, she was handing me the ammunition I would need to eventually bury her. I also started observing. I would sit on my deck and watch her interactions with her own residents. I saw her measure the height of a neighbor's grass with a ruler. I saw her issue a ticket to a family because their children's tricycle was left on their own driveway for more than an hour. I spoke to a few of the neighbors quietly, men and women who were terrified of her. They told me stories of liens placed on homes for unpaid fines over bird feeders and holiday decorations. She ruled Whispering Pines not as a president but as a tyrant. Her power was based on a combination of public shaming at HOA meetings and the labyrinthine complexity of the CC and RS, which she interpreted however she saw fit. She wielded the binder of rules like a weapon, but I suspected she hadn't ever truly read it with any comprehension. The dock remained the central point of contention. After I installed the gate, the use of it dwindled, but some people still climbed over it. I never called the police. I would simply go down, politely inform them they were on private property, and they would leave. A few of them would say, "But Brenda said this was ours." I would just nod and say, "I'm afraid she's mistaken." Brenda's frustration grew. She saw the gate not as a legal boundary, but as a personal insult. It was a visible symbol that her authority had a limit. It was a border she could not cross, and that was intolerable to her. She started leaving notes on the gate. Then, sending more formal, increasingly unhinged letters. They spoke of historic precedent and implied easements. These were legal-sounding terms she had likely gleaned from a late-night television lawyer commercial, and she used them with a confidence that was inversely proportional to her understanding. I saved every single one. My HOA folder was now 3 inches thick. It sat in the bottom drawer of my desk, a patient, silent predator. And that brought us to this morning, the bolt cutters, the triumphant smile, the public declaration of war on my front lawn. She had finally escalated from paper threats to a physical act. She had crossed a line from civil harassment to criminal damage. And as I stood there, phone recording, I knew the time for quiet observation was over. It was time to go to work. After she and her 2 hired hands had paraded down my dock as if they'd just liberated a conquered territory, I walked back to my house. I didn't engage further. I didn't replace the padlock. I left the gate swinging open. Let them have their moment. An open gate can be closed again. A cut padlock can be replaced. But the video of her ordering it cut, the recording of her admitting who she was and what she was doing, that was permanent. I went to my office. It's my favorite room in the house, a space of quiet order. Oak bookshelves line 3 of the walls, filled with engineering texts, legal casebooks, and local histories. My desk is a large antique partner's desk that Eleanor bought for me when I first opened my own firm. It's a workspace, but it's also a sanctuary. I sat down in my leather chair and took a deep breath. The anger was there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach. But it was a controlled anger, a focused anger. It was the feeling I used to get when an opposing counsel in a zoning dispute would present a deliberately misleading survey. It was the anger of a professional seeing an amateur make a mess of things. First, I downloaded the video from my phone to my secure server. I made 3 copies, one on a physical hard drive, which I placed in my fireproof safe, one on a cloud server, and one I emailed to my personal email address, creating a time-stamped, third-party record. Evidence preservation is lesson 1. Next, I took out the HOA folder. I spread the contents across my desk, 3 years of letters, violation notices, canceled checks, photographs, and my own dated, handwritten notes of observations. It was a detailed, undeniable history of a campaign of escalating harassment. She thought these were individual skirmishes. I knew it was a single, continuous narrative. Then, I wrote a letter. Not to Brenda. Writing to Brenda was pointless, like reasoning with a hurricane. I wrote it to the Whispering Pines HOA Board of Directors, care of their registered agent, which was a law firm downtown. I also addressed it to Brenda explicitly, as president. It was a formal cease and desist. I used precise legal language. I cited the state criminal code for trespass and damage to property. I described the incident at 6:42 a.m., noting I had a clear video recording of the event and of Ms. Albright's admission. I attached a copy of my property deed and the relevant page from the county plat map, with my parcel highlighted in yellow. The map clearly showed parcel 14B, my lot, as a distinct and separate entity from the common areas of the Whispering Pines development. I stated that any further entry onto my property by any member of the HOA or their agents would be met with immediate law enforcement involvement. I demanded reimbursement for the destroyed padlock, $58.99, and I attached the receipt from when I bought it, and stated that the bill for the locksmith she had threatened me with would be summarily ignored. I concluded by stating that this letter was a final attempt to resolve the matter informally, before pursuing all available legal remedies, including but not limited to a quiet title action, a civil suit for damages, and seeking a restraining order against Ms. Albright personally. I didn't send it by email. I printed 5 copies. I sent one via FedEx overnight to the HOA's law firm, requiring a signature. I sent another via certified mail, return receipt requested, to the HOA's official mailing address. I sent a third, also via certified mail, directly to Brenda Albright at her home address. The fourth copy went into my folder. The fifth, I decided to deliver myself. Around noon, I walked over to the Whispering Pines Community Clubhouse. Brenda's car, a pristine white Lexus, was in the President parking spot. I walked in. The clubhouse was one of those soulless, beige-on-beige places. Brenda was in the small office, holding court with two other women from the neighborhood. She saw me and her face hardened. "What do you want?" she snapped. And I said nothing. I simply walked to her desk, placed the envelope containing the letter in front of her, and turned to leave. "You can't just barge in here," she sputtered, her voice rising. "This is a private office." The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. I paused at the door. "I believe you'll want to read that," I said, my voice calm and even. "I would also advise your board members to read the copies I've sent them. You have 24 hours to respond." As I walked back across the lawn that separated our worlds, I could feel her eyes on my back. I knew what she would do. I had seen her type before. She would not see the letter as a warning. She would see it as a challenge. She would not read the deed or look at the plat map. She would see them as forgeries, as tricks. People like Brenda are not swayed by facts that contradict their worldview. They simply build a stronger, more fortified worldview. And they tear up the facts. I was almost certain of it, and sure enough, later that afternoon, as I was transplanting some azaleas, I saw the mail carrier's truck stop at Brenda's house. I watched through a pair of binoculars from my office window. She came out, signed for the certified letter, took it inside, and less than a minute later, came back out and stuffed the torn pieces of my letter and the envelope into her recycling bin. I took a time-stamped photograph of her doing it. Another entry for the folder. The next morning I was back in my office. The 24-hour deadline I had given was a formality. I knew she wouldn't comply. It was time to stop reacting and start working the problem from my end, on my terms. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. This was a land use case, and I knew exactly how to handle it. I called David. David had been my paralegal, my research assistant, my right-hand man for the last 15 years of my career. He was technically retired like me, but I knew he got bored. He lived for the hunt. The thrill of digging through dusty county archives and arcane digital databases to find the one document, the one forgotten ordinance that could decide a case. Arthur," he said, his voice warm, "don't tell me someone built a fence in the wrong place." "Worse," I said. "They cut the lock on my fence and claim my dock is theirs." There was a pause and then a low chuckle. "Oh, this is going to be fun. Who's the lucky defendant?" I explained the situation. The HOA Brenda Albright. The handshake deal with the original owner. The lack of a recorded easement. David listened patiently. When I was done, he just said, "Okay, so a standard quiet title action, plus damages for trespass and harassment. But you want more than that, don't you? You want to dismantle the whole operation." He knew me too well. "I want it to be definitive, David. I want it to be so airtight that no one ever questions who owns that dock again. And I want her to pay for it. Personally, if possible." "Then we need to go deeper," David said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. "The lack of an easement is good. The video is great. The paper trail of harassment is beautiful. But we need a bombshell. We need something they don't know exists. Something that comes out of their own files to hang them." "Get to work," I said. "Start with the original development permits for Whispering Pines. County Planning and Zoning Office. Should be from around 2001, 2002. Look for anything related to the Marina. Environmental impact statements, permit applications, everything." "On it," he said. "I'll see what I can find in the digital archives first. I'll bill you my I'm bored, and this is fun rate." While David went on his digital archaeological dig, I began my own preparations. I drove into town and met with a lawyer, a sharp young woman named Ms. Evans, who specialized in real estate litigation. I didn't need her to strategize. I had the strategy. I needed her to be the public face of it, to file the motions, to speak in court. I laid the HOA folder on her conference table and walked her through the entire history. She listened, her eyes widening slightly as I detailed the methodical way I had paid the fines and documented everything. "Mr. Pendleton," she said when I was finished, "this is the most well-documented case of neighbor harassment I have ever seen. You've done 90% of my job for me." "I believe in being prepared," I said. "I want you to draft a complaint. We'll sue for quiet title to remove any and all imagined claims on my property. We'll sue for damages related to the trespass and property destruction, and we'll name the HOA as a corporate entity and Brenda Albright as an individual for tortious interference." "Naming her personally is aggressive," Ms. Evans said, a hint of admiration in her voice. "We'll need to prove she acted outside the scope of her authority as president, with malice." "I believe we can," I said, thinking of the torn-up letter in her recycling bin and the years of targeted fines. "File it, but don't serve it yet. I want to have everything in place. I have a feeling Miss Albright is about to make another mistake." I was right. 2 days later, a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. A man in a cheap suit got out and taped a notice to my front door. It was from the HOA's law firm. It was a final demand letter. It accused me of creating a public nuisance, of violating unwritten prescriptive easement rights, and demanded I remove the offending gate permanently. It also contained a notice of a special emergency HOA meeting to be held in 1 week's time. The agenda item was listed: to vote on the levying of a special assessment of $50,000 against Parcel 14B for damages to community assets, and to authorize the board to place a lien on the property for failure to pay. It was beautifully, breathtakingly stupid. A lien on a property they didn't govern, a special assessment against a non-member. It was a legal tantrum, and it was the perfect procedural trap. I thanked the man, took the letter and made a copy for Miss Evans and a copy for my folder. The next afternoon, David called me. His voice was electric. "Arthur, you are not going to believe this. I'm in the county's digital records archive. I pulled the master permit file for the Whispering Pines PUD, the planned unit development." "And?" I prompted. "And it's a gold mine. As we suspected, the developer, Clark, had a hell of a time with the Marina permit. The Department of Environmental Protection was all over him about the dredging, so he amended his application. He submitted a new site plan, and on that site plan, he explicitly designated the main pier, your pier, as existing private structure on adjacent parcel 14B. I felt a slow smile spread across my face. "So it's right there on the official plans." "Oh, it gets better," David said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The county planning board's approval was conditional. I'm reading the approval letter right now. Condition 4C states, and I quote, "The developer must secure and record a formal access and maintenance agreement with the owner of parcel 14B for the use of the primary pier prior to the issuance of any certificates of occupancy for lakefront lots." But he never did it. He just had that handshake deal with old man Henderson. He got the certificates of occupancy without ever fulfilling the condition. That's a major violation. "It is," I agreed. "But that was the developer 20 years ago. How does that help us with Brenda today?" "Because, Arthur, my friend," David said, and I could practically hear him grinning through the phone. "The best part, the absolute bombshell, the HOA's own governing documents, their sacred CC and Rs, which I also downloaded from the county register. Article 9, Section 2, under Community Property and Amenities, states that the maintenance and use of the community marina facility shall be governed in accordance with all stipulations and conditions of," and then it lists a permit number. Arthur, it's the same permit number from the county planning board. Her own rulebook explicitly incorporates the very document that says your dock is private property, and that they have no right to use it without a formal, recorded agreement that does not exist. I leaned back in my chair. It was perfect. It was a closed loop. Brenda Albright, in her blind adherence to a rulebook she'd never bothered to cross-reference, was bound by the very document that proved her entire case was a fraud. She had been waving a sword, not realizing the hilt was in her hand but the blade was pointed directly at her own chest. "David," I said, "you're a poet. Send me everything. Certified copies." "She had no idea," David said, echoing my own thoughts from the day of the bolt cutter incident. "She had no idea she was living in a house of cards built on a foundation of unfulfilled permit conditions." "No," I said, looking at the fat manila folder on my desk. "She didn't, but she's about to find out." The stage was now set. I had the law, the facts, the history of harassment, and now the bombshell. All that was left was the performance, and Brenda had already been kind enough to schedule it for me. The day after my call with David, Brenda made her next move. It was predictable. She was losing control of the narrative, and when a person like Brenda feels control slipping, they don't retreat. They double down. They create a new, more dramatic crisis to distract from the old one. I was in my garden, watering the hydrangeas, when a sheriff's department cruiser pulled into my driveway. A single deputy got out. He was young, looked to be in his late 20s, with a crisp uniform and an air of professional detachment. His name tag read Miller. Brenda was right behind him, pulling up in her Lexus. She practically sprinted from her car to the deputy's side, her face a mask of practiced distress. She had two of her board member cronies with her, both looking grim and self-important. "Deputy, thank you for coming so quickly," she said, her voice trembling slightly. It was a masterful performance. "This man," she said, pointing at me, "has been terrorizing our community. He has illegally blocked access to our lake, and now he is threatening us. We are elderly residents, and we are frightened for our safety." Deputy Miller looked from her to me. I hadn't moved. I was still holding the garden hose, the water gently arcing onto a patch of thirsty mulch. I turned off the nozzle and set the hose down carefully. I gave the deputy a calm, neutral nod. "Sir," the deputy said, his tone even. "I'm Deputy Miller. We received a call about a disturbance, a dispute over property access." "There's no disturbance here, deputy," I said quietly. "He's lying," Brenda interjected, stepping forward. "He threatened us. He sent a threatening letter. He's trying to steal our dock." Deputy Miller held up a hand, a clear gesture for her to stop. He looked back at me. "Ma'am, let me handle this. Sir, can you explain to me what's going on?" This was a critical moment. It was a test. The encounter was being recorded on his body camera, creating another official record. My response had to be precise. "Certainly, deputy," I said. "This is my property. My name is Arthur Pendleton, the owner of this parcel. The woman who called you is Miss Brenda Albright. She is the president of the neighboring homeowners association. Yesterday morning she and two men she hired came onto my property and destroyed my personal property, a padlock on my gate. I have a video of the incident. In response, I had a formal cease and desist letter delivered to her and her board, informing them that they were trespassing. She has now called you, making false allegations, in an attempt to use your authority to further her campaign of harassment against me." Every word was chosen carefully. My property, owner, destroyed my personal property, video of the incident, campaign of harassment. These were legally significant phrases. Brenda looked like she was about to explode. "He's the one harassing us. That dock belongs to the community. We've been using it for 20 years. Deputy Miller sighed, a small, almost imperceptible sound of a man who was already tired of this. "Ma'am, do you have any documents to show that the HOA owns the dock? A deed? An easement?" "It's historic use," she insisted. "It's a prescriptive easement. It's common knowledge." The deputy turned back to me. "Sir, do you have proof of ownership?" "Of course," I said. I walked into the house, leaving the door open, and returned a moment later with a thin file. I didn't bring out the whole HOA folder. That would be overkill. I brought out 3 documents. "Deputy, this is a certified copy of the deed to my property, recorded with the county. This is the official county tax map, showing my property lines. And this is my driver's license to confirm my identity. As you can see, the property, including the land on which the dock is built, is titled solely in my name. I handed them to him. He took them, his eyes scanning the documents. He was professional, but I could see the subtle shift. His posture relaxed slightly. He was looking at facts, not listening to a tantrum. He compared the name on the deed to my license, then looked at the clear black and white lines on the tax map. "These seem to be in order," he said, handing them back to me. He then turned to Brenda. "Ma'am, based on these documents, this appears to be Mr. Pendleton's private property. This is a civil matter. I cannot force him to grant you access. If you believe you have a legal claim, you need to take it to court. But I am advising you, and anyone from your association, not to enter this property again. If you do, you could be cited for trespassing." Brenda's face went from red to a pale, mottled white. She had expected the deputy to be her personal enforcer. She had expected him to be swayed by her performance of a concerned community leader. Instead, he was being swayed by a few pieces of paper. "This is ridiculous," she stammered. "Are you taking his side?" "Ma'am, I'm not taking anyone's side," Deputy Miller said, his voice firming up. "I'm looking at the legal documents presented to me. Right now, he has presented proof of ownership, and you have presented an opinion. If you have documents to the contrary, I'll be happy to look at them." Of course, she had nothing. Her entire world was built on verbal assertions and social pressure. The idea of needing a document, a piece of paper with a county seal on it, seemed to be genuinely foreign to her. Before she could launch into another tirade, I spoke again, looking directly at the deputy's chest where the body camera was mounted. "Deputy Miller, for the record, and for your report, could you please note that I have presented you with a valid deed and tax map confirming my ownership, and that I have formally restated to you that Miss Albright and the Whispering Pines HOA do not have permission to be on my property. I would also like to formally report the destruction of my property by Miss Albright yesterday." "I've noted it, sir," he said, his eyes meeting mine with a flicker of understanding. He knew exactly what I was doing. I was creating an unimpeachable record, witnessed by a law enforcement officer. He gave Brenda a final warning to pursue her claims through civil court and not through confrontations or by calling 911 for non-emergencies. He got back in his cruiser and drove away. Brenda stood there for a long moment, her cronies whispering nervously to her. She shot me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. This was a humiliation for her. She had brought the law to bear, and the law had calmly and politely told her she was wrong. She had lost publicly in front of her followers. I knew with absolute certainty that this would not make her reconsider. It would make her desperate. And a desperate Brenda was a predictable Brenda. The emergency HOA meeting would be her Alamo. The encounter with Deputy Miller had an unintended, positive consequence. It was a public display of resistance, and it seemed to embolden others. The next evening, there was a tentative knock on my door. It was an older gentleman, one of my other neighbors who was also not part of the HOA. His name was George Henderson, the son of the man who had sold me the house. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, twisting a worn straw hat in his hands. "I saw the sheriff here yesterday. I saw her face after he left." "George," I said, "please call me Arthur. Come in." He sat nervously in my living room, perched on the edge of the armchair. "Arthur," he began, "that woman has been making life miserable for people in this area for years. My father, he made that deal with the developer, Clark. He was too trusting. He thought it was just a neighborly thing to do. He never thought someone like her would twist it into a weapon." "I understand," I said. "Your father was a kind man. The world has changed." "It has," he said, his eyes hardening a little. "She's fined me twice for having a commercial vehicle on my property. It's my son's plumbing van. He stops by to check on me. My property isn't even in the HOA. She has no jurisdiction. But it was easier to pay than to fight her." He looked down at his hands. "I was a coward. You were not a coward, George. You were choosing your battles. Some of us just have a higher tolerance for protracted conflict. He looked up, a new resolve in his eyes. Well, I'm tired of choosing to lose. I heard about the meeting she's called. To put a lien on your house, it's insane. He leaned forward. I might have something that could help. I was on the initial HOA board, right after it was formed. I quit after a year because I couldn't stand working with her. But I kept some things. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, old-school cassette tape. This is a recording of a board meeting from about 18 years ago. We were discussing the Marina. Clark, the developer, was there. And Brenda. She was just the secretary then. On this tape, he said, tapping it with his finger. Clark explains the dock situation. He says clear as day that the main pier is private property and that the HOA's access is dependent on the goodwill of Mr. Henderson. And then, Brenda, she says something. I never forgot it. She says, well, goodwill doesn't last forever. We should just act like it's ours. Possession is 9/10 of the law. Eventually everyone will forget it wasn't ours to begin with. I stared at the tape. It was a smoking gun. It was proof of intent. It showed that she knew from the very beginning that the HOA had no legal claim to the dock, and that her entire historic use argument was a deliberate, long-term strategy of manufactured reality. George, I said, my voice quiet. This is more than helpful. This is decisive. I have the original, unamended bylaws too, he added, before she started adding her clarifications and amendments without proper votes. There's nothing in them about fining non-members. He handed me a thin binder. The coalition was beginning to form. First, the fearful ally, George, providing the history and the proof of malice. The next piece fell into place 2 days later. I received an anonymous email. It was short and to the point. Mr. Pendleton, I am a member of the Whispering Pines Board. I cannot give you my name. Brenda has not shared your letter or the details of the police visit with the full board. She is railroading this vote. She is telling everyone that you are a hostile developer trying to seize community assets. Most of us are just regular homeowners, and we don't understand the legalities, but this feels wrong. The meeting is on Thursday at 7 p.m. in the clubhouse. Be prepared. She has told her supporters to come and shout you down. This was the disillusioned insider, someone on her own team who knew she had gone too far. They confirmed her deception and gave me the final piece of intelligence I needed. She wasn't just misleading the community. She was misleading her own board, keeping them in the dark about the true legal jeopardy she was exposing them to. I now had everything. I had the law on my side. I had the documents to prove it. I had video evidence of her crime. I had a police report corroborating my story. I had testimony and evidence of her long-term, malicious intent. And I had a mole on the inside. I spent the next 3 days with Missy Evans, my lawyer, preparing for the meeting. We didn't prepare a defense. We prepared an offensive. We prepared a presentation. We had the plat maps and permit documents blown up onto large foam core boards. We had the audio from George's cassette tape digitized and cleaned up by a professional. We had a crisp, concise PowerPoint presentation that laid out the indisputable timeline of events. The night before the meeting, Brenda made one last, desperate move. At 9 p.m., another process server showed up at my door. This time, he served me with a temporary restraining order. She had gone to a judge, ex parte, meaning without me being present, and claimed I was a threat to her. The order forbade me from coming within 100 feet of her or her property. It was a transparent, last-ditch attempt to legally bar me from attending the very meeting she had called to ruin me. I read the order. It was full of lies, describing me as an unstable and aggressive man. I looked at the process server. She does know the HOA meeting is at the clubhouse, which is less than 100 feet from her property, right? The server just shrugged. I just served the papers, man. I immediately called Ms. Evans. She got a TRO. There was a moment of silence on the line. Then Ms. Evans started to laugh. A genuine, hearty laugh. Oh, she is a gift that keeps on giving. This is perfect. Attempting to use a protection order to prevent you from attending a meeting where you can defend yourself against a $50,000 lien. A judge is going to love that. It's abuse of process. We'll add it to the lawsuit. Don't worry, Arthur. I'll handle this. I'll be there tomorrow night as your counsel. The order applies to you, not me. She just guaranteed that she won't be able to speak to you directly. She has to go through me. She has no idea how badly she just blundered. I hung up the phone. Brenda thought she had checkmated me. In reality, she had just handed my queen a clear path to her king. The board was set, the pieces were in motion, the game was about to end. The clubhouse at Whispering Pines was packed. The air was thick with a cloying mixture of cheap air freshener and simmering resentment. Ms. Evans and I arrived at 6:45 p.m. for the 7 o'clock meeting. As per the restraining order, I took a seat in the very back row, as far from the podium and Brenda's front row seat as possible. Ms. Evans sat in the front row, reserved for counsel, her briefcase on the chair beside her. The room was divided. On one side sat Brenda's loyalists, a group of about 30 residents who looked at me with open hostility. They whispered and pointed. On the other side were about 20 other homeowners who looked nervous and uncertain. I saw George Henderson among them. He gave me a small, determined nod. I also spotted the woman I suspected was my anonymous emailer, a younger board member named Sarah, who studiously avoided making eye contact with anyone. At 7:05 p.m., Brenda, flanked by the HOA's lawyer, a portly, sweating man named Peterson, strode to the podium. She banged a gavel. "This emergency meeting of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association is now in session," she announced, her voice resonating with theatrical gravity. "We are here tonight to address a grave threat to our community." She began her performance. It was a masterpiece of manipulative rhetoric. She spoke of the spirit of community, of the shared memories on the lake. She painted me as an outsider, a wealthy interloper with no respect for their traditions. She wove a narrative where the dock was a sacred communal space, a birthright that was being cruelly stolen from them and their children. "This man," she said, pointing a trembling finger toward the back of the room where I sat, "wants to put a price on our way of life. He wants to lock us out of our own lake. He has harassed us, he has threatened us, and he has shown nothing but contempt for the values we hold dear." Tears welled in her eyes. It was a practiced, effective display. Her supporters murmured in agreement, some of them glaring at me. "He left us no choice," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "We have been forced to take action. The board proposes a special assessment of $50,000 against his property to compensate the community for the loss of access to our primary Marina asset. We also propose placing a lien on his property to ensure payment. This is not something we do lightly. This is to protect what is ours." She finished her speech to a round of applause from her faction. She looked triumphant, confident. She had framed the narrative. She was the victim, the defender of the community. I was the villain. "We will now vote on the motion," she declared, moving to ram the decision through before any real debate could occur. "Point of order, Madam President." The voice was calm, clear, and cut through the applause. It was Ms. Evans who was now standing. All eyes turned to her. Brenda's face tightened. "This is a homeowners meeting, Counselor. You have no standing here." "On the contrary," Ms. Evans replied smoothly. "You have called a meeting to vote on levying a $50,000 penalty against my client, Mr. Pendleton. He has every right to be heard. Since you have taken the extraordinary and legally dubious step of obtaining a restraining order to prevent him from speaking for himself, I will be speaking on his behalf. I believe the homeowners here deserve to have all the relevant facts before they vote on a measure that could expose this association to catastrophic legal and financial liability." The word catastrophic hung in the air. The nervous-looking homeowners sat up a little straighter. Brenda's lawyer, Peterson, shifted uncomfortably. "This is highly irregular," Brenda stammered. "So is placing a line on a non-member's property, Ms. Evans countered. "I have a short presentation. It will clarify the ownership of the dock and outlined the potential consequences of this vote. I'm sure the members would want to be fully informed, wouldn't they? She looked around the room, making eye contact with the uncertain faces. Before Brenda could object further, George Henderson stood up. Let her speak. We have a right to hear both sides. A few other voices echoed him. Brenda was trapped. To deny Ms. Evans the floor now would look like she had something to hide. Fine, she snapped, her voice losing its gentle tremor and taking on a hard, brittle edge. 5 minutes. Thank you, Ms. Evans said. She walked to the front of the room where an easel and a projector screen had been set up. I won't need 5 minutes, she began, her tone professional and dispassionate. She was not giving a speech. She was presenting a report. First, she placed a large foam core board on the easel. It was the county plat map. This is the official, recorded plat for the Whispering Pines development and the surrounding parcels. As you can all see, she said, using a laser pointer, the HOA common area is here, and this parcel, 14B, owned by my client, is a separate, distinct property. The dock in question is located entirely within the boundaries of my client's private property. Murmurs went through the crowd. It was one thing to hear Brenda talk about community assets. It was another to see a legal map with clear, hard lines. Next, Miss Evans clicked a button on a laptop, and the projector flared to life. It was a high-resolution scan of my deed. This is the deed to Mr. Pendleton's property. It is a public record. It confirms his sole, unencumbered ownership. She then put up a summary of Deputy Miller's police report. Last Tuesday, Ms. Albright called the sheriff's department. Deputy Miller responded. He reviewed these same documents and concluded that the property belongs to Mr. Pendleton, and that this is a civil matter. He warned Ms. Albright against further trespassing. Brenda's face was becoming a thundercloud. Her supporters were starting to look confused. The narrative was slipping. Now, Miss Evans continued, Ms. Albright has based her claim on historic use. Let's examine that history. She looked toward George Henderson. Mr. Henderson, your father sold the property to my client. Could you please share your understanding of the original arrangement? George stood, his voice shaking slightly at first, but growing stronger as he spoke. He told the story of the handshake deal, the neighborly accommodation. Then, he said, I have a recording from an early board meeting where this was discussed. Ms. Evans clicked the laptop. A slightly tinny but clear audio file began to play. First, a voice identified as the developer, Clark, saying, So, to be clear, access is at the goodwill of Mr. Henderson. It's his dock. Then, a younger, sharper voice, unmistakably Brenda's, spoke. Well, goodwill doesn't last forever. We should just act like it's ours. Possession is 9/10 of the law. Eventually, everyone will forget it wasn't ours to begin with. A collective gasp went through the room. It was stunning. It was a confession. Recorded 2 decades ago, it proved her entire public position was a lie she had knowingly perpetrated from the very beginning. Brenda went rigid. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a waxy, artificial pallor. Her lawyer, Peterson, looked at her with an expression of pure horror. That's taken out of context, Brenda managed to say, but her voice was thin, unconvincing. Ms. Evans didn't even acknowledge her. She moved to her final point. Finally, she said, let's look at the document that governs all of you, the Whispering Pines, CC and IRs. She projected a page from the bylaws onto the screen. It was Article 9, Section 2. She highlighted the text with her laser pointer. The community marina facility shall be governed in accordance with all stipulations and conditions of county permit. O1-Z-4-573. Ms. Albright often quotes the CC and Rs, Ms. Evans said, but she seems to have missed this part, because this, she said, clicking to the next slide, is county permit O1-C-4-573. The screen now showed the official county planning board document. Ms. Evans highlighted 2 sections. The first was the site plan map, where my dock was clearly labeled existing private structure on adjacent parcel 14B. The second was Condition 4C. The developer must secure and record a formal access and maintenance agreement with the owner of parcel 14B prior to the issuance of any certificates of occupancy. There is no such recorded agreement, Ms. Evans stated, her voice resonating with finality. It does not exist. Which means for 20 years, the HOA's use of that marina has been in violation of its own founding permit. The very rule book Ms. Albright uses to fine you for the color of your mailboxes contains the proof that her entire claim to my client's dock is fraudulent. This was the moment, the collapse. Brenda Albright stood frozen at the podium. Her mask of righteous indignation didn't just crack. It disintegrated. For a split second, her face was utterly blank. It was the look of a chess player who has just realized they've been in checkmate for 10 moves and had no idea. The arrogance, the confidence, the performative victimhood, all of it vanished, replaced by the cold, stark terror of a person who has been so thoroughly, so methodically, and so publicly exposed that there is nowhere left to hide. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She just stared at the projected document, the evidence of her own undoing, displayed for the entire community to see. Ms. Evans let the silence hang for a moment, letting the weight of the revelation settle over the room. Then she delivered the final blow. Therefore, she announced, her voice ringing with authority, any vote to levy a fine or place a lien on my client's property would be an act of bad faith harassment, undertaken with full knowledge that you have no legal basis for doing so. If you proceed with this vote, we will not only sue to have it nullified, but we will also seek punitive damages against the HOA, and because she has acted with demonstrable malice and outside the scope of her authority, against Ms. Albright personally. Furthermore, as of this morning, we have already filed a quiet title action to permanently bar any claim by the HOA to my client's property. We have also filed a civil suit for trespass, property damage, and a pattern of harassment, citing the evidence you've seen tonight. We will also be petitioning the court to assign all of my client's legal fees to the defendants. She turned to the board members, sitting next to Brenda. I would advise you to think very carefully about your fiduciary duty to this association. Continuing to follow Ms. Albright down this path will be financially ruinous. The HOA's directors and officers' insurance will almost certainly deny coverage for actions taken with such clear malice and disregard for your own governing documents. The room erupted, not into applause but into a chaotic buzz of angry, confused voices. Brenda's supporters looked betrayed. The homeowners who had been on the fence now looked furious. They weren't angry at me. They were angry at her. They realized they had been lied to, manipulated, and put at enormous financial risk to serve her personal vendetta. The board member I knew as Sarah stood up. I call for a motion to table the vote on the lien indefinitely. Second, another board member shouted. All in favor? Sarah asked, taking charge. A forest of hands went up, including several from Brenda's formerly loyal faction. The motion is tabled, Sarah announced. Then she looked directly at Brenda. I also call for an immediate vote of no confidence in our president, Brenda Albright. Brenda just stood there, swaying slightly, her face a mess of disbelief and humiliation. Her lawyer, Peterson, was already packing his briefcase, trying to distance himself from the train wreck. He leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Likely, resign. But she didn't seem to hear him. The community she had ruled with an iron fist had turned on her in an instant. Her power, built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, had evaporated under the harsh, unforgiving light of documented fact. From the back of the room, I watched it all unfold. I felt no triumph, no surge of victory, just a quiet, weary sense of order being restored. The game was over. I had won, but the prize wasn't the dock. The dock had always been mine. The prize was the silence that was about to return. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The HOA meeting was the public execution of Brenda's reign. The legal proceedings were the formal burial. The HOA's insurance carrier, upon being presented with Miss Evans's evidence package, immediately understood their position. They sent a letter to the board stating that they would not cover any judgments related to the case against me if Brenda Albright remained in any position of authority. They recognized her actions as willful and malicious, falling outside the protections of their D&O policy. Faced with this, the board had no choice. At a hastily called executive session the following week, they formally requested Brenda's resignation. When she refused, they used the authority in the bylaws George Henderson had provided, the real bylaws, to remove her from office for acting against the best interests of the association. Sarah, the disillusioned insider, was appointed as the interim president. The lawsuit moved forward, but it was a foregone conclusion. The HOA's new counsel, appointed by the insurance company, quickly sought a settlement. They agreed to every one of our terms. The court entered a judgment granting my quiet title action, permanently extinguishing any and all claims, real or imagined, that the Whispering Pines HOA had on my property. They agreed to pay for the installation of a new, much more formidable gate. They paid a modest sum in damages for the trespass and harassment. And most importantly, they agreed to cover all of my legal fees, a sum that ran well into the 5 figures. For Brenda, the consequences were more personal and far more severe. Our suit against her as an individual proceeded. The audio recording was the key. It proved her malice, her long-term intent to defraud. The judge in the civil case was not amused. He found her personally liable for a significant portion of the punitive damages, a sum the HOA's insurance would not touch. The judgment was substantial enough that, within 6 months, a "for sale" sign appeared on her lawn. The house she had lorded over her kingdom from had to be sold to satisfy the debt she had incurred through her own arrogance. I heard she moved to another state, presumably to find a new community to terrorize. The abuse of process claim regarding the restraining order was also addressed. A different judge reviewed the case, saw that she had obtained it under false pretenses specifically to silence me at the HOA meeting, and not only dissolved the order, but also fined her for filing a frivolous and malicious action. It was another small but satisfying piece of procedural justice. With Brenda gone, a sense of sanity returned to Whispering Pines. Sarah, as the new president, led a full review of the HOA's rules and past actions. The binder of Brenda's arbitrary amendments was thrown out. The original, properly voted on bylaws were restored. They established a review committee, and George Henderson was one of its first members. Over the next year, they systematically reviewed every fine Brenda had issued over the last 5 years. Dozens of them were deemed baseless, and the money was refunded to the homeowners. The reign of terror over grass height and tricycle placement was over. My relationship with the community changed too. I was no longer the villainous outsider. I became something of a reluctant folk hero. People would wave as I drove past. Neighbors would stop by to thank me, not just for the dock issue, but for liberating them. George Henderson became a regular fishing buddy. We'd take my boat out on the lake, and he'd tell me stories about his father and the way the area used to be. Sarah would occasionally email me to ask for my unofficial opinion on some land use question, which I was happy to provide. The wall of hostility that Brenda had built between my property and the rest of the neighborhood had crumbled. I installed a new gate at the end of my dock. It was a handsome thing, made of powder-coated aluminum, with a secure, key-coded lock. I had a small, tasteful plaque made and affixed to it. It read, "Pendleton Pier, private property, established 1968. It was a simple statement of fact, indisputable, permanent. A few months after everything had settled, Miss Evans sent me a final package. It was a bound volume, embossed in gold leaf on the spine. The title was Pendleton versus Whispering Pines, HOA et al. Inside was a complete record of the case, the initial letters, the photographs, the video transcripts, the police report, the legal filings, the audio transcriptions, the bombshell permit documents, and the final judgment. It was my old manila folder, transformed into a legal monument. I placed it on the shelf in my office, next to my engineering textbooks. A testament to the power of quiet preparation. Now, in the mornings I stand on my deck with my coffee and the sounds are right again. The lapping of the water, the cry of the loon, the distant hum of the highway. There are no grating sounds, no angry voices. The silence is peaceful again. Sometimes I look at the new gate, gleaming in the morning sun, and I think about the nature of ownership. Brenda thought ownership was about control, about power, about forcing your will onto others. She thought a dock was something you could possess through sheer force of personality. She was wrong. Ownership, I've come to realize, isn't just a name on a deed. It's a responsibility. It's the stewardship of a small piece of the world. It's the duty to maintain order, to respect the lines, to uphold the rules. Not just the ones you like, but all of them. The rules are what separate us from chaos. They are the invisible architecture of a peaceful life. I hold the key to the gate in my hand. It's cool and solid. A simple, tangible object. It's not a symbol of victory. It's a symbol of order. A symbol of a boundary that is clear, respected, and absolute. It is the key to my property, yes. But it is also the key to my peace. And that, I have learned, is the only ownership that truly matters. I take a sip of my coffee. The lake is calm, the world is quiet. Everything is as it should be. On paper and in fact.